Hello everyone, welcome back to our YouTube series, Making Sense of It All. My name is Emma Reese and I work at the Better Policy Project. It's a project designed to improve economic and financial literacy. To find more information and learn more, you can watch the videos on our YouTube channel or go to the Better Policy Project website, that is www.thebetterpolicyproject.org. Today is the second video of the series where our director, Douglas Laxton, is going to share his expertise and cover topics such as how we teach macroeconomics in the global forecasting school, the role that flexible prices and sticky prices play in the CPI basket. You would consider a sticky price a price that doesn't change very frequently, such as household furnishing and rent. And examples of flexible prices would be food, gas, clothes. Those are prices that change more frequently. We will also look into in the Atlanta Fed as well. We will be looking at some other different charts comparing how both of these prices progressively increased and got lower over time. So in this episode of the series, Douglas Laxton is going to be explaining how these numbers affect the US economy. So stay tuned.
So this is day two. I'm cutting a quick summary of how we teach macroeconomics at the Global Forecasting School to my students, but we're opening this up to other people that might be interested in what we do here. My initial experience coming out of grad school I came out of the University of Western Ontario in 1981. I went to the Bank of Canada. They had extremely high standards. It was just a kind of a random, luck that you had this collection of people that were so smart. I mean, both in terms of research, modeling, and current analysis. So I entered as a consumption specialist during the Volcker disinflation, and I was completely overwhelmed by numbers. Okay, like this place, they had they could slice and dice everything. I almost quit actually because I was terrible at it. And then something really changed my life. I learned a very, very important lesson in life. There was this guy named Brian O'Reilly, and he was my boss's boss. And he came in one day, and it was just not typical of Brian to do this. And he said, would you like to go out for a beer tonight? And I said, yes. We went out for a beer. And he said, I see that you're struggling. And I just wanted to talk to you. And I learned that was a lesson in life that I did the same thing with a few other people, and the results were absolutely incredible with those people. But what he then said was, so I told him, I said, look, I'm thinking about quitting, that this just wasn't what I was expecting. And I'm not very good at it. And he said, well, my advice to you, Doug, you can quit if you want, but the problem is that if you quit, as opposed to giving it your best, is you might regret that. Whereas if you just give it another go, that's what he said. And that's what I did. And I went in and I set out to learn, much like I learned in grad school, because I learned how to learn, to figure out how I could analyze data with these other people, where they would keep, 100 numbers in their head that would be turning over every month. Okay. And then, of course, some numbers they would commit to memory, which is what I'm trying to get you guys to do. Now, I believe that the only way to do that is with pen and paper, but the Gen Zs here might prove me wrong. But that's how I did it, that I would write down numbers If there's a piece of paper like what's on the screen right now, I would have a printout of it, and I write down the number right beside the number, and of course people would ask me, that seems very strange, and I said, yes, my mind works in very strange ways, because it seems like when I write down that number, I can commit it to memory, of course, along with a story that goes with the number and so on. So this is really important. That's why I'm telling you, you have to do that if you're going to be able to do this on the level that we're talking about. Now, this week, any good macroeconomist, if there is potential risk on the horizon, you think about that risk. Okay. And so the way we're going to think about things is there various regimes. Okay. I think that's the best way to think about macroeconomics right now, is that you could be in this regime, okay, maybe a regime with high interest rates, and you could be in this other regime with low interest rates. Okay. And the underlying theoretical framework that we're going to be using here is the idea that these regimes could be locally stable. So, in other words, when you go into the high interest rate regime, because there's a perception of fiscal crisis, that perpetuates the local stability of being in that regime. Okay, so in other words, so I'm going to talk through that. That's going to be a big theme. And then we're very lucky to have 80 from the Central Bank of Israel, who is an absolute expert on fiscal crises, because Israel had a fiscal crisis, and then of course it had a lot of indexation. It's got a lot of great data. Svetlana here is our expert on Israel. We're going to be inviting him to talk about fiscal crises and the empirical evidence, that suggests that the perception of a fiscal crisis obviously depends on fundamentals, okay, but perceptions of which regime you're in really matter. Okay, so you're going to get a situation where basically the market tests countries that have high levels of debt and potentially unstable fiscal dynamics. And when those markets test them, interest rates are higher. People do this calculation and ask, what has to happen to the primary balance, to stabilize the debt dynamics. And of course, we'll go through later in the week the Congressional Budget Office's projections, but those projections assume 4% 10-year bond rate. The reason I talk about 10-year bond rate in this case is that that's just a little bit above the average maturity structure of the US debt. Okay, so the mental calculation where there's a perception of explosive fiscal dynamics, okay, and potential fiscal, the government going bankrupt, becoming insolvent. The perceptions of that, you just need to think about how much does the primary balance need to adjust to stabilize the debt dynamics. And of course, that depends on what the interest rate is. So if the interest rate is 1 percentage point above the nominal growth rate of GDP, in other words, the tax base of the economy, if it's 1 percentage point above, it means the primary balance has to be approximately 1% in surplus. There's a little bit different. We're going to go through the math this week about, because you also have to account for the fact that you have debt and a steady state government deficit to GDP ratio, but the primary balance will have to go into surplus when the interest rate's above the growth rate of the economy. So you think about that and you go, could the 10-year bond rate be 6? Okay. Now, if it was 6, that would be 2 percentage points higher than what the CBO projections have, right? So you'd say, geez, that's another 2 percentage point. You have the primary deficit right now is 2.5 and 2.5 to 3%. And so you'd have to say, well, it would have to swing from 2.5% deficit to 2 percentage point surplus. That's 5 percentage points. What's the likelihood that the Democrats and the Republicans could get together to work out that kind of arrangement? And the answer is, what? So, okay, let me ask you this now. Okay, ready? Okay. How do you start a teddy bear race? Ready, Teddy, go. Okay. Let me ask you this. If the interest rate were to go to 6, okay, if the interest rate were to go to 6, the primary deficit would have to go from my 2.5, a deficit, up to about 2 percentage point surplus. So that's, say, a 5 percentage point swing. Okay. What do you think the likelihood of that is? Okay. Conditional on the 6% interest rate. Sergey, what's your likelihood? You got the last one so close with 4. Now we'll see what you can do.
I think very low.
Very low. Okay. Yeah. So that basically means when you think about the distribution of interest rates, right? Effectively, it means that there's a upward part of a corridor where you'd have fiscal solvency. Okay. Now, of course, then the interest rate wouldn't stop at 6, right? Because it would go to 7. 7 was where the European debt crisis. So the 10-year bond rate on Italian bonds on a monthly basis, so a little bit higher on a daily basis, right? But, just before Mario Draghi said, we'll do whatever it takes, okay? Plus then, of course, some actions by the ECB. But it was really we'll do whatever it takes, and then some action afterwards. So we're going to be going through that. Did anybody disagree with Sergey? Anybody want to shout out? No? Okay, well, that means that's why we're focusing on it this week, because if you believe that, then there's a risk there, a significant risk. Okay, so what are we going to be talking about? Yesterday, I talked about the U.S. household balance sheet, and you can go and look at it. It's really simple. Between the end of the first quarter of 2020 and the end of 23, okay, S&P doubled, okay, went from 2,500 to 5,000. You can see, am I likely to remember these numbers? Am I likely to remember these numbers? Yeah, I see a smile there. Okay, yes. And the reason I'm going to remember these numbers, right, so these ones are being stored indelibly in my brain, is that it's a part of a story, okay, about how we talked about potential fiscal crisis and financial crisis. Do you understand? So, and that's how a good macroeconomist remembers numbers, because the numbers are there because they're a part of a narrative and so on. In this case, an emerging narrative. It might happen and it might not. We want you to think about, different scenarios, which is what we do in the global forecasting school. Okay, so we looked at that, and the answer is really simple: $50 trillion. And of the $50 trillion, 17 trillion was an increase in the value of property. Okay. So 17 trillion of the $50 trillion. By the way, the correct measure of savings is the change in wealth. Okay, I know you guys are used to those national accounts measures of saving, but conceptually, the much better way of thinking about saving is that it accumulates to savings. And so when we think of national accounts saving, we think of maybe measuring a little bit of financial saving, say because during COVID, you can't buy what you want to buy, or you might be afraid to buy stuff, there's because of all the uncertainty. So there was clearly an increase in precautionary saving, and people couldn't spend on certain things. And as a result of that, here's some DSG economics. Sergey, hold on to your hat here. But in a world where the elasticity of intertemporal substitution is high relative to the elasticity of substitution between different things. So think of domestic vacations and international vacations. And so if I will substitute when there's lockdowns and I can't fly to New Zealand to see the thing on my bucket list, then what I do is I take that budget. Okay, I don't spend it on a domestic vacation. I take that budget and save it. So that means the intertemporal elasticity of substitution is high. Okay, that I'm prepared to save. Okay, for that international vacation. That basically is not a close substitute, the domestic and the internet. So that's an example of using kind of DSG economics, okay, logic, which is copacetic, okay? We're about DSG economics, not about silly DSG models, and so on. So we're going to be thinking about what are the risks of this, and of course, what will trigger it. In addition, this week we have to cover the US CPI. It's going to be released at 8:30 on Wednesday. And so this is an opportunity for me to take you through how we think about inflation. Okay. So, and as well as to take you through all the data that I want you to cover. Okay. I'm going to ask you, what is the Cleveland Fed monitoring, okay, for April and May for, say, the core PCE, okay? And what implications does it have on the quarterly growth rate? In other words, is this measure of core inflation creeping up as we expected it would to better measures of core inflation, sticky price inflation, and so on. Okay, so you should look at this. You should know what it is they're monitoring. Okay, they don't have a crystal ball. They simply separate this stuff, the energy component out, for example, because if we have gasoline prices and diesel prices and so on. So they can map from that stuff, that are typically unpredictable. So gasoline prices are completely unpredictable, but once you know what they are, the conditional prediction on things like the component of the CPI that has gasoline, that relationship is very tight. Okay, and you can even dig down. The way I do it at the Bank of Canada, when I was up to those standards, I would understand the economic concept, know when the statistical agency was serving, what markets they were serving, and then effectively we'd replicate everything. My maximum monitoring error was 0.1. So in today's world, and that was back then actually when the inflation rate was around where it is now. In other words, is it 0.1? Is it 0.2? Is it 0.3? Is it 0.4? Or is it 0.5? Okay, on a month-on-month basis. Okay, so that was a world basically before. So when we disinflated in the early 80s, down to around 4 or 5%, depending on the measure for the US, with sticky price inflation be like a little bit more than 4. Okay, but for PCE, kind of got down to around 4. So that was a period before the second disinflation in the early 1990s. And that's when I was monitoring the CPI using this methodology, which I've never seen replicated to this level of quality at anywhere except the Fed. Okay, so And so when I went to the IMF and I talked to people at the Fed and knew them very closely in terms of how I would talk to them about US data and stuff. Transparency was incredibly high then between researchers and so on. And so I knew the standards at the Fed were up to the level of standards in 1981. I would say 1981 and up till I'd say we started losing a bunch of our current analysis guys. They were hired off to places, like the OECD and the IMF and stuff like that. So we lost a lot of that talent. And of course, you lose the talent, the standards decline, and then of course you eventually lose it, and so on. There's also this interesting issue that maybe I can ask you guys to talk about. Could it be that because of the technology that young people use today, that 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 maybe you're forgetting about how to do basic math and manipulate numbers and work with numbers like in the trillions and like those big numbers? Could it be that maybe you get lost a little bit about that kind of stuff? Because I'm saying that because it was a real, like, I struggled at that myself, and I find that that my students typically, you seem to struggle, but you're gonna have to get through those struggles. I can't say anything else. Okay, now let's talk about what we care about here, which is this right here. This is what is extremely worrisome, and so on. And so a couple of weeks ago, there was a chart, I think it was produced by Goldman Sachs. It started floating around social media. In fact, Larry Summers referred to it as well, where they looked at the forward curve in the United States. And the forward curve, so they were looking at 5-year ahead treasuries. Sorry, five treasuries with a 5-year maturity 10 years ahead. Okay, and Larry Summers came out and said that the Fed, which assumes that the neutral rate is about 2.5%, it's shifted up to 2.6. Okay, but he was arguing, no, look at the economy. GDP now is monitoring 4% growth in the second quarter. Okay, and that just carries on our consumption story, Miriam, which Jared is almost finished drafting up to these new chart standard stuff I was talking about. But that was been driven by this high wealth and disposable income. Those two variables fit consumption perfectly again. Okay, so during COVID, the consumption function was distorted. But over the last year, that same old great consumption function that predicted consumption on a conditional basis with lagged net wealth and today's real disposable income, or a permanent estimate of that, which is actually more predictable, okay, than the volatility and disposable. So the standard error of that regression is 0.3. Okay, so that's come back over the last year. Okay, so that means that we can explain why the U.S. economy has not slowed down, because basically U.S. consumption and domestic demand has been chugging along. Okay, well, so you have that. You have financial conditions. Remember, we were looking at bank lending tightening. We're going to be looking at those numbers pretty deeply. Okay, and so we had a few 40s. In other words, the net percentage of banks that were tightening credit standards minus the banks that were easing credit standards, that number was around 40. Okay, and when you looked at that, we're gonna look at that data later in the week. It seemed to line up with historical recessions, right? So if we thought of the empirical work on all the U.S. recessions, we had Michael Kiley from the Fed, who gave a wonderful presentation that's on our YouTube channel that talks about the historical evidence on what predicts recessions. And of course, the slope of the term structure, whether or not inflation is high, because the history of US inflation is one of monetary policy boom bust cycles, okay, where they let inflation out of the bag. And then, of course, at some point, they take some action. And that means that the slope of the term structure, because we didn't have good measures of inflation expectations, the slope of the term structure kind of picked up those periods of tightening and easing and so on. Okay, so that's, on the basis of the 500 basis point increase in the Fed funds rate, and so it increased relative to longer term interest rates. That would say recession. Well, we didn't get a recession. But then we got what we would expect under endogenous money creation, that the banks would tighten their credit standards on their risky customers, and they did. So, for example, in the commercial real estate part of the survey of the senior loan officer survey, they tightened credit standards, much more aggressively on mortgages. Plus, mortgage rates went way up. Okay, so they started to reflect a risk premium. Okay, so historically, mortgage rates, longer term mortgage rates, are tightly correlated with government bond deals plus a risk premium. Now, obviously, that risk premium changes during periods of extreme things like the global financial crisis, when there's a problem specifically in the real estate market and so on. So, but those risks had come down, and it appears that at least financial markets are concerned about about the risks on their balance sheet from, say, higher interest rates. Now, we don't know whether or not adequate attention is being given to that. And the reason is that if we listen to Sergey's logic, if the interest rate were to go to 6, if you're talking about fiscal crisis and so on, there ain't nothing. Nobody's got a pocket that's big enough, the government or financial markets, to backstop that. That's what a global financial crisis is. So, when you're reading things like financial stability reports, there's a lot of assumptions in those things about the type of shock. For many years, I was quite shocked. Financial stability report of the U.S. didn't include these high interest rate kind of scenarios, which obviously are very relevant. And the problem there is because, why do we have all this debt? Is that people were so convinced that they were going to stay in this low interest rate world. And that just shows how dangerous it is to think about policy as always staying in one regime. So, right. So anyway, so why is this so dangerous? Well, we can see that the terminal point of the expected path of the Fed funds rate at the end of 2026, which would normally be the period that we would think that the interest rate would be back to the neutral rate and so on. And so it is shifted up. The Fed still has in the dot plot 2.6% for a median estimate. Now, they do have some people on the FOMC, because in the dot plot, the upper value of that interest rate in 2026 has shifted up to, I think, about 3.8 and so on. And so there's somebody on the FOMC that is concerned that maybe the neutral rate has shifted up. But why is this so important? Well, because the current 10-year bond rate is about 4.5%. Okay. And so if the terminal rate on the short rate, on the Fed funds rate, is 4%, as you can see in the chart, okay, that means that the term premium, has got to be really, really low. Okay, and this is a good way to cross-check estimates of the term premium that you're going to find on we're going to look at the term premium by Kim and Wright in a second here, but having a 10-year bond rate of 4.5 and the neutral rate being 4%, we'd say that's only a 50 basis point term premium, and that is way below what the term premium was historically when we had inflation and so on. So, for example, in the period of the Great Moderation before the global financial crisis, the term premium had fallen to 1%. Okay, and that was about half of what it was during this period that I was talking about between. So we disinflated in the early 80s from 10% down to 4 during that period where inflation was around 4 or 5. In other words, from the mid 1980s to the early 1990s before we had the second disinflation. So that was your 4% inflation regime. Term premium back then was about 200 basis points. Okay, so why is this worrisome? Well, if you take that 400 basis points in the chart right now, okay, and you add 200 basis points, voila, there's your 6%. Okay, and according to Sergey, that would mean a fiscal crisis, and so on. So that's why, because that term premium is compensation for higher interest rate risk. So as soon as people start to believe that interest rates could be higher, they demand more compensation. The term premium would rise, and then of course people would realize that it's unstable. So basically we're no longer in a locally stable regime, in the sense that small shocks that drive the term premium up could result in, okay, now of course then what does the Fed have to do? Fed can't allow that to happen. And so that means that they effectively have to go soft on inflation. Well, as soon as there's a perception that they go soft on inflation, now you have a problem, because that's another reason for the term premium to rise and so on. So that's why this stuff is very important. We have the March CPI, or sorry, the May CPI that's going to be released on 8:30 on Wednesday, and so I just want to take you through some key data. Starting with, we're going to look at the Atlanta Fed sticky price. By the way, everything on the Atlanta Fed, you should be looking at it, because the way it's presented, I mean, it's truly remarkable what type of public service they are providing. Starting with basically sticky price inflation. We have two working papers, one from Armenia, one from Georgia, that basically take the concept of sticky prices, which is a terrible, terrible term, but we haven't been able to think of anything better. What we mean by sticky prices are prices that are typically, and I really want to emphasize that word typically, that are typically set infrequently. Okay, and so the Atlanta Fed basically has on their website very nice documentation about what this sticky price inflation is. So it's up to standards, in the sense that they have interesting data as well as very nice documentation about how it's constructed. Okay, so this is what we're looking at. Again, a lot of these numbers you have to have in your head, so that when you are looking at inflation data, you're not just reporting it's like some number. but you understand the economic concept, you understand what is driving the process, and so on. Now, the big problem during COVID, Larry Summers was absolutely right in 2021. We just haven't decomposed what the sources of all the policy errors were in terms of how people did analysis. But one was clearly using these crazy, I'll emphasize crazy, like infrequently, statistical measures of inflation, core inflation, that thought about just throwing out prices that were changing by a lot, okay, and so on. This is not what good economists do, okay? Good economists love variation in the data because there's usually a lot of economics in that variation, okay? So what good macroeconomists do is that they recognize that the CPI is the thing that everybody is focusing on. It does have measurement errors and so on, but it is the data that is reported about prices in most economies. So what we do here is to decompose the CPI into flexible price goods and services versus those prices that are set infrequently. Now, what are those prices? The ones on the left are pretty obvious. Things like motor fuel and fresh fruits and vegetables, and those. So those types of prices can be influenced by idiosyncratic shocks. Okay, things like bad weather and stuff can affect vegetable prices. But, and this is important, when there is generalized excess demand pressures in the economy, and we think conceptually correctly, not some crazy filtering exercise that some people try to teach you and stuff. But when we think conceptually and we aggregate over all those markets on the left-hand side, we would say, well, if there's generalized excess demand pressures, there's some idiosyncratic shocks driving some prices up and down, but when there's generalized excess demand pressure, they should show up in flexible prices before those prices that are set infrequently. Okay, so you see that it is almost tautological that when we think about the work by Olivier Blanchard and Ben Bernanke, okay, so Ben Bernanke and Olivier's work basically look at the CPI and the employment cost index. So we're going to be going into the methodological issues associated with those variables, but what they find is that prices lead wages a lot, or the CPI leads wages, and that makes perfect sense, as we're going to see, because wages are a sticky price. Okay, like it's a price that is also typically set infrequently in large parts of the U.S. Labor market. And so obviously, in a proximate Granger causality sense, okay, prices will lead, or the CPI will lead wages. Okay, so that's kind of obvious. And then we're going to go back. So I asked Deanna and Svetlana to dig into this, but if you look at so first of all, let me just finish. I'm sorry. So flexible prices are those prices that are set for no longer than 4 months. Okay, so you can see the frequency of adjustment. Tobacco and smoking products, 4.2 months, again, typically. And then on the right-hand side, you can see a bunch of prices that are set typically for 5 months or more. Okay, so infants and toddlers apparel, 5.3. Okay, not very important, only 0.2% of the budget. Okay, so you guys should take a look at this and have kind of like a story. And then there's that rent of primary residence. Okay. And so that would mean somebody actually renting an apartment. Okay. And then you've got those 4 OERs. Okay. And that's owner occupied housing. And obviously, what is the price of owner occupied housing and stuff? And what they try to get at is what the consumption equivalent would be. So therein lies, some potential conceptual issues, and you can see it's really important. So the shelter component in the CPI is a big number, and so on. And so we're gonna be looking at that in a second, okay? But basically, flexible prices, despite the terminology, the bad terminology, represent about 30% of the CPI. Sticky prices represent 70. Okay, even if it only represented 10, you might even say it's even more important to have it and stuff. But in this case, it represents 70% of the CPI. You throw out food and energy to get core sticky, and you're down to 64. Okay. You go through these categories and basically exclude the ones that are traded goods, okay, which would be more consistent with our way of thinking about inflation in the global forecasting school, because we think about the monetary transmission mechanism for an open economy, even like the United States. And so during COVID, for example, so let me back up. So again, we don't throw volatile things out of things. That's not what good economists do. Good economists come up with concepts. And one very important concept was discovered by Rudy Dornbush in his very famous overshooting paper, where he showed that in the presence of sticky prices, the exchange rates have to adjust to play an important shock absorber in the economy. Well, fast forward to Ken Rogoff and Maury Upsfeld's book on new open economy macroeconomics that helped us to think about how to distinguish between different types of prices, like traded goods prices and non-traded goods prices, because obviously we have to keep track of traded goods prices because they incorporate very strongly exchange rate effects. Non-traded sticky prices are things that we want to be very stable. If we're doing a good job at providing a nominal anchor, non-traded sticky price inflation is going to. And so if you throw out an additional 8 percentage points of the traded goods in that second column on sticky price inflation, things, for example, like household furnishing and operation. So in a lot of those cases, we saw those prices rise massively because people that were supplying things like furniture stores couldn't get the furniture from their international suppliers. Okay, so that's an example, a clear example where you want to throw out these traded goods prices to get a better measure of inflation. Okay, so that's something. We have a work by Deanna and Angela. They were the ones that kind of took the lead on this stuff. We applied it to Armenia. Took quite some time. It always does that the first time. We then applied it to Georgia in a much shorter period of time. And now we think that if we have access to the data, okay, which we do in the case of the US, we can do this extremely quickly. But again, if you have access to the data. So you need to have these detailed components, which we do in the case of the US, as I'm going to show you in a second. Okay, so now, very simple question. I was asked the question by Yuri when I was talking about sticky price inflation. He asked me this question. Isn't it a story about shelter? And I said, no. Shelter is a very important part of the story about why underlying inflation or sticky price inflation has been quite high. As I'm going to show you the numbers in a second, but the current year-on-year rate is 4.5, and the 3-month over 3-month has been rising and now is above 5. I'm going to show you those data in a second. And so he asked me this question in the seminar because he'd read something in the Financial Times that it indicated this is mainly a story about that. And so one way of assessing a central bank is to look at the quality of statistics on the statistical agency's website, because if statistics like this are being used for policy, you will see that they're very nicely organized. Okay, so this is table 1. So this is released when like on Wednesday at 8:30, we will have this table. This table is amazing because basically it should allow us to effectively replicate this kind of table for any country. So that's what I describe as an amazing table. Okay, because usually when you do things for one country and then you try to do it for another country, there's something strange that's different about the country. So designing a table is actually quite challenging. Now, in this case, the question I was asked by Yuri was, is it just a story about shelter? And I said no, that it is also a story about prices in the sticky price basket that also have this inflation premium that is much higher than 2%. Okay, so that's what I said in response to the seminar. I then, of course, dug into these numbers on Saturday. Okay, remember the guy that wasn't very good on numbers because I was curious. When I did the work on Saturday and opened up the sheet, it was fun. Do you understand? It wasn't work because I was really curious. And when I looked at this table, I thought, oh, this is really cool because we can just turn this into a Python report and run it for anyone. Okay, now the reason that it's good, such a good table, it's got every component in the CPI. It's got the relative importance. And then it's got some unadjusted indexes. And that's really, really important because if you're going to seasonally adjust data, you have to be an expert, if you're an economist, in how those seasonal adjustment methodologies are working when you apply them in a brute force method on big data sets. Okay, because if the structure of the seasonality has changed, okay, so maybe there's a big event, okay, that changes the structure of seasonality, the standard X11, X12 packages will mess up. Okay, plus on virtually every time series that you look at that has been seasonally adjusted with those packages, and you look at the autocorrelation functions of the seasonally adjusted series and the partial autocorrelation functions of those, there's clear, significant seasonal correlation. So in a lot of cases, for example, there'll be a little negative statistically significant correlation. but sometimes it can be positive too. And that's an indication that the brute force method. And so why is that important? Well, it doesn't mean that you don't want to do seasonal adjustment, but you want to think about the economics sometimes in the unadjusted data, like inventories, Christmas inventories. Why the heck would anyone seasonally adjust Christmas inventories? Because the whole economic process is about the businesses building up their inventories for Christmas. And of course, the question they're asking, am I going to be able to sell this stuff at Christmas and so on? So the economics of many things should be done on an unadjusted basis. Okay, so that's why they report the unadjusted percent change. Okay, sorry, I'm going to go to looking at the wrong table here. Table 2 is the one you want to look at. And so it has the unadjusted percent changes, okay? And it starts off with the previous year. And why is that? Well, because if something happened last year, it could be falling out of the year-on-year calculation, which is the one that, everybody will be reporting, that year-on-year calculations. It's basically just filtered a little bit. Okay, now you guys have to understand what's driving, what's going into that year-on-year calculation and what's falling out of it. So this is nice that they have initially starting off with the year-on-year change. So the percent change year-on-year from March of 2024 to March 23, and then looking at the month-on-month change. Okay, now remember, one's year-on-year and the other one's a monthly change. And then the seasonally adjusted percent changes over the last 3 months. Okay, so what numbers would you have to remember, Anahid, in this table? What numbers would you have to remember? Point 3, 0.4, 0.4. Okay. Obviously, you want the 3.5, you want the 3.5, you want the 3.5, but you would remember 0.3, 0.4, 0.4. Okay. And then you probably in your head do a moving average of that. Okay. Now, are you ready? Everybody ready? What is 0.1 annualized? What is 0.1 annualized? Everybody, what is 0.1 annualized? 1.2. 1.2.
And just multiply 12, yeah. But to be
okay.
exact, maybe not just.
Oh, yes, but you guys are too exact. I'm trying to teach you economics and perspective. Okay, so 0.1, okay, annualized is 1.2. What is 0.2? Too late,
2.4.
too late, 2.4. What is 0.3? Too late, too late, 3 points. You guys are supposed to be Armenians here that solve quadratic equations in grade 8. Okay, let's see. Emma, you're not supposed to be very good in math. We'll see if you could get this one. 0.4.
4.8.
Oh, and you're and you said that you're not good in math. We have all these Armenians here, and it turns out you're wrong. It's 4.9. Okay, I'm very sorry about that. Okay, but that's the point. But none of the Armenians got it either. That's the point where you can't simply, you have to compound. Okay, so as long as this number, okay, as long as you know that, okay, then you can take these monthly numbers, right, and you can calculate a moving average. Rudik, what is that? 0.4, okay, which we know would be about 4.9, okay? Now, why do you need to know that? Well, because you need to combine monthly numbers and numbers at annual rates, which I'm going to show you here, because we're now going to look at another report, okay? we're now going to look at another report, which is back, at our sticky price, measure of inflation. Okay, so here I have to move you on my screen here. Back to sticky price inflation. Now we're going to go down here. And we're going to look at this wonderful, wonderful chart, okay, that gives you all these options, okay? So the very first thing is let's get the history down. You're going to be able to read this in Archam's video. He's the 16-year-old summer intern from last year, okay? Olivier Blanchard sent me an email on Sunday saying, can I provide comments on his paper with Ben? And so I assigned this to a 16-year-old summer intern named Archam in Diligent, at the Diligent Training and Research Center, and said, I want you to explain our perspective on these issues using flexible and sticky prices. Now, when I first saw this chart that the Atlanta Fed produced, I kicked myself 10 times because having studied all these different country data sets, Israel, Turkey, those types of inflations down to many countries that had kind of 10% inflation, countries like India and so on. So had I studied all those data, I kind of kicked myself because I should have taken a stab at producing the sticky price inflation, because there's nothing special, because once you make a decision about what those items are, once you classify them, you should be able to construct this. It just happened that the way they constructed it was based on a micro study, the importance of research, having a micro study where people looked at those classifications of those goods and services, and then tried to estimate how long they are typically set for. Things like property price, like a rental unit. That convention is the same in many, many countries. It's typically a year. And why is that? Well, when you think of markets, there are going to be these real rigidities, and then there are going to be things like nominal rigidities. So you want to think about both those types of things all the time. And so a real rigidity is things like the academic school year. Okay, so say some people will be starting school in September. And what year do they start in Georgia and Armenia?
In September, yeah. School starts in
September. Okay. So you just think, well, you want the student's going to want to have some predictability, to his rent, right? And maybe there might be some administrative student housing or something of this nature, but there's some real things related to the calendar, the annual calendar, that some prices could be linked to, like property rental units and stuff. Okay, so anyway, so I assigned this to Archam, and he gave this wonderful video that we posted on YouTube on Wednesday at 6. And he didn't work any overtime. A remarkable discipline of a young adult that showed that we could have very high standards, that a high school student could basically do a presentation in 3 days, not working any overtime and so on. And so I think we'd all learn from from his habits. He's a pragmatist. That was his dominant learning style characteristic. So very good at hitting deadlines and stuff like that. But the thing I want to show you on the screen here is that you can see. Okay, and I want to start the story. So I want to start the story in the 1970s. Okay, so you're looking at the flexible one. Okay, And you can see the flexible one leads in 73, 74. That's when oil prices quadrupled. Okay, and they eventually started raising interest rates. So we're talking about money back then at the Bank of Canada. They had talked about monetarism and of course using money to try to control inflation. That didn't work out so well because we got another inflation, and you notice that sticky price inflation. Okay, that that gold thing. It's lagging. It's lagging kind of on the way up, and it's lagging on the way down. See it lagging on the way up and then lagging on the way down. Okay, and you can see that even during the 1981-82 disinflation and stuff. So flexible prices went down and this lagged. That's really, really important, okay? Because if you don't understand that, central banks like the Czech National Bank, many central banks, really messed up their disinflations because they raised interest rates to really high levels, created the conditions for a recession, and then didn't start backing off, didn't start reducing interest rates really aggressively, and their economy went through like a really big cycle, with excessive unemployment and stuff. And so the way to think about that is that you don't wait when you disinflate, like they disinflated in the early 80s. You don't wait for the very last sticky price measure of inflation to decline, because if you do, you'll get a massive overshooting. And the Fed that were disinflating in the early 80s knew that, but some central banks, that just started inflation targeting in the 1990s, they didn't know that. And so playing a very conservative strategy to gain credibility actually resulted in excessive unemployment. And unfortunately, still to this day, lingering hatred of the central bank by the politicians and so on. So part of the reasons the problems that the Czech National Bank has had problems now are related to legacy and not understanding the difference between sticky price inflation and flexible price inflation. And so you can just keep on seeing that when there's a cycle, that sticky prices lag the process. Okay, so you can see that. I think it's pretty convincing. It's even more convincing because our best measure of wages is the wage tracker, and when you line up the sticky price measure of inflation and the wage tracker, they line up. Okay, which means that telling a story that the CPI leads the employment cost index, that is pretty obvious. That should not be a surprise to anyone, right? Because if some prices are flexible and there are some sticky prices that represent 70% of the CPI, and if those sticky prices are highly correlated with wages, now you've proved that wages are a sticky price, just as most people would tell you. Now, there's a bit of an exception that I'm asking Deanna and Svetlana to work on today, is this period in the 1960s, okay? Like in Canada, oops, I didn't mean to do that. So in Canada, in 1966, so if you understand the early stages of the inflation process, in Canada, the United States, a lot of the parliamentary democracies, Europe, for example. So in Canada, it was like 1966, and there was a famous strike called the Strike of the St. Lawrence Seaway. And what happened is the government intervened, okay, and sided with the unions, and they got these humongous wage increases. Okay, now if you look back, it's like 5 cents and 10 cents and 25 cents. It doesn't look like very much to us today, but back then, these were humongous numbers, like 30% and so on, big numbers. So as soon as they did that, then all the other people in the sector, in the labor market that had market power went on strike. Okay, and so unionization moved through initially the manufacturing sector, and then the construction sector, and then the post office and places like that. And obviously, if people were getting big wage increase, well, going back in that time, there was about a 2 percentage point. They have to track down the data because it's just from my memory, and we all know how faulty that is. But there was a 2 percentage point increase in labor share. Okay, so there was a clear wage push, or sorry, wage price kind of spiral. So we'd say that wages were approximate cause of CPI inflation back there. Again, using Granger causality in the sense that that information on wages would be useful for predicting future underlying inflation. Okay, but during all the other times, we would say that prices, Granger cause sticky prices and wages. Okay, now why is this important? Okay, well, it's important to understand that that's not the whole darn story. That is just a small little wee point, a very small little wee point, that ultimately monetary policy is responsible for inflation. Okay, and so how much pass through you have from flexible prices to sticky prices, that's dependent on how well monetary policy anticipates the excess demand conditions from looking at flexible prices. Okay, so it has to be studying those things, not as statisticians, but as economists, understanding demand and supply in those various markets, and whether or not prices have fallen behind the overall change in the price level and so on. Okay, so that's what I want to emphasize. But go back and listen to the Archon video. It has the most wonderful. I think that's the video. Actually, I'm not quite sure. He's got another one. He was only there a month. He transcribed all of my videos into text, and then cut 2 videos himself. One was this one, and then another one. Okay, and all skills that are easily learned. Okay, there aren't any skills that he has that aren't easily learned, and I'll be explaining what those skills are, and I think what it would take to actually learn those skills. But okay, but back to the what's going on now. Okay, and so now we're just going to hone in, okay, and look at the numbers. I like to include the global financial crisis, okay, because it allows us to have a little bit of perspective. We could back this up actually to, like I was saying, to include like 1985, that period where inflation. So this is here. Just let me back it up a little bit. There. Let's see. Will that introduce too much noise? No, that does a good job here. And so you can see what I'm talking about here. So inflation. If we look at, we went from the double digits, okay, down to about 5%. See those numbers in my mind, 5%. Okay. And so what's happened? Well, this number right here is about 2.5%. Okay. And so that's your standard kind of measurement error. If you think of the PCE target as 2%, there's a little bit of measurement error in this thing. Plus, this might include some things that are not in PCE. So there might be a slight difference there. But so just think, when you look at the Atlanta Fed website again, you look at all the various measures of inflation, they include the historical averages over this kind of sample. And so they would say, the CPI, for a 2% PCE target would be about 2.3. Okay. And for the sticky price one, it would be about 2.5. Okay. So that's consistent with, what PCE inflation was. Okay. So now let's look at the numbers about where we are now. So what do we want to look at? Well, the way we want to look at it is I'm going to get rid of flexible. And I want to look at initially at the 3-month over 3-month. And now because I'm looking just at the recent period and so on. So now I can just click on it. Okay. Well, first of all, look at it. And I can see, the year-on-year rate of sticky, that's the 4.5 that I told you earlier. Okay. And then I said, but on a 3-month over 3-month basis, it's rising. Okay. So that's why I showed you the math before about the 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, 0.4, and so on, so that you can translate between these measures of inflation that are at annual rates. Okay. So these are at annual rates, right? So again, 5.2 would be 0.4 something, right? Because we know 0.4 is 4.9, right? And so we know that this would just be a little bit higher than 0.4. Okay, so basically we have sticky price inflation that has been edging up, and on a year-on-year basis, it's 4.5. Okay, so I expect you to know all those numbers, know that history, listen to the Archum video and stuff. There's a great line in the video, which we can use to make fun of bad economics or harebrained economics, or economics based on linearity and so on, because a lot of that statistical work we will be doing as well will be based on linearity, because when we make the assumption of linearity, everything becomes so tractable, the estimation and that sort of stuff. But the difference is that we'll be training you as economists to be very critical of any models that are based on the assumption of linearity, including our own models. Okay, so never say the model says kind of mentality and stuff. So you have to know these numbers. It's really nice because you can think of the 12-month as being a moving average of the 3-month over 3 months. So the end of each quarter, for example, if you looked at the 3-month over 3-month annualized and just added those up, at the end of each quarter, you should have approximately the year-on-year. Okay, so you can just think of the year-on-year as being a moving average. Well, same thing. You can also look at the recent monthly numbers and do the same thing. You can think of the moving average of the month-on-month changes as the 3-month as just being a moving average of the last 3-month monthly changes, right? So you automatically get this nice perspective that allows you to look at filtered values of inflation like year-on-year or 3-month over 3-month or anything you want, okay, and to have a perspective on those things. Will we provide value of? You betcha. On Bloomberg, the type of people that are commenting on Bloomberg right now are irresponsible, because they think that you can just run some statistical models and then get on Bloomberg and start talking about equity markets. So the funny thing that I was watching is a couple of weeks ago, a few weeks ago, I cut a video, yikes, inflation's rising, because I'd watched a couple analysts. One said, we're monitoring 0.43, and the other one said 0.46. And I'm thinking, oh my Lord, there's no economic narrative here, and people are providing these crazy forecasts, some of which based on artificial intelligence, where the level of economic intelligence is going down. Unfortunately, I don't think it's bounded by zero, because in this case, a misunderstanding of things could result in bad things. So bad economic analysis isn't just have zero benefits; it has negative benefits and so on. So I expect to understand a story behind these numbers. So in response to Yuri, when he asked me about this article in the Financial Times, was it all story about sticky price inflation? Well, now I can see, the 3-month over 3-month is around 5. I can shoot back to my table 2. I can whiz down there to the housing component, if I can find it. It's after men's apparel, that's for sure. And recreational things, probably after alcohol. There we go. Okay. We have shelter. Okay. And we can see that it is 0.6, 0.4, 0.4, 0.6, 0.4, 0.4. Okay. So we know from the math, okay, that if sticky price inflation, okay, represents 70% of the CPI, okay, and shelter price inflation is in the 0.4s, and overall sticky prices is 0.4, then we know that on average, all those other prices that aren't shelter, okay, on average, some of them will be going up and down, and you're free to look at all of them in this report. It's there. And what's special about it is that it can be replicated with any country data set. Okay, if you have the weights, so you need to know what the relative importance of the components are. Okay, and you just need to brute force seasonally adjust them and put a big be careful notice on it. Okay, but at least then that will start the process about where economists can look at the data and try to understand the unadjusted and the seasonally adjusted, think about the economics, and then interact with experts that understand the methodology of seasonal adjustment. Now, I was really lucky in the early 80s in the sense that our statistical agency, Stats Canada, was the leading one of the top 2 statistical agencies in the world. I tested Stats Canada. I called them a few months ago to see if I would get the same level of service that I got back in the early 1980s. It's a really fun story, Deanna, okay, because I told them the story about how I knew all these people and what the standard of service was, okay? And they actually gave me some data free. Effectively, the data that I had suggested to them 30, 40 years ago about how to do input-output analysis and stuff. And so they cross-checked me, and then were nice enough to actually show me how to go through input-output tables, okay, so that we could really understand prices from a cost push perspective. Okay, so sort of breaking prices into things like labor costs, intermediate goods, energy prices, and so on. So if you have the input-output tables, you can create what are called price input-output tables, so you can trace through. We should have that for all countries, but unfortunately, You're only going to have that when you have advanced monetary policy analysis, because when you have advanced monetary policy analysis, you have guys like me talking to the statistical agency about how economists need to think about organizing their data. So Norges Bank, richest country in the world, they went there, terrible data. Okay, the Bank of England, the Bernanke report just came out. You can't even get service price inflation seasonally adjusted. Okay. But when you go into their data and you start digging at it, terrible documentation, and this is a, central bank that has, I think, a 30 million pound budget for research and statistics, and they don't have the basic data that a macroeconomist would need to understand what it is that's going on and so on. Okay. So, so that I'm going to, so I talked about the CPI. I talked about the sticky price CPI. I didn't talk about the Atlanta Fed wage tracker. Okay. So I need to talk about that. Okay. Because that is something you need to follow, because it turns out, as an expert, when I was at the Bank of Canada, I held all these current analysis jobs. So I was used as the guy that would always be ready to move to the next job. And what I found is that, and this is featuring in the way I'm trying to teach you, is that when you learn how to do current analysis on one sector, like prices and so on, that move into wages is a piece of cake. Okay. You learn how to do consumption, moving to investment is a piece of cake, right? So at the Bank of Canada, people used to like to stay in their jobs, for longer, sometimes too long. And they would be reading too many newspapers and stuff like that, as opposed to establishing contacts with the statistical agency to understand the economic concepts. And, I could learn a job in literally a month. Okay. I'd establish all those contacts and think about the concepts, think about how to organize the data and stuff. So the Bank of Canada kind of used me to sort of develop these jobs. So when I was a price specialist, which was for, 5 months, we built a model, as well as a monitoring system, to monitor inflation on a month-on-month basis, looking at all the available information. Maximum monitoring error of 0.1 month on month. And so there's some remarkable stories that are very applicable to you. Let me tell you one. So in this way of doing things, where jobs pass from one person to the next, as well as analytical tools. Okay, so in this case, it was using TSP. Today we would use Python or R to do this kind of thing. We had developed a little surveillance system to monitor the Canadian CPI. Okay. And the advice that was given to me when I took over the job for, I think, 4 or 5 months, was the guy said, okay, the previous guy had got the monitoring error down to this. And I can't improve it. I couldn't improve it because there's these nasty gasoline prices and airline prices, and they have these price wars, okay, where some gasoline stations would reduce the price. And of course, the elasticity of demand that they would face would be quite high. So they would be increasing their revenue and profits if they could attract all the other customers and so on. Okay. And the other one was airline prices, and the same story. Basically, the elasticity of demand, if you're going to fly on one airline versus another, if you reduce the price by 10, 15%, you can attract a lot more customers and stuff, right? So because I was a researcher, had to do the price job as well as build a model of wage and prices, which I did with Serena Ng. This wage price stuff that Blanchard and Bernanke is talking about, that's what effectively we were doing back then. And so this is what I did, Deanna. You're going to love this. So the way the previous person had done the job is to read all the newspaper articles on whether or not there were stories about gasoline price wars and airline price wars. Okay. And I'd do that too, but on the bus on the way home. Okay. I would go through all those articles because it was a good way of getting a stock of stories and thinking about things that I'd want to check. But I wanted to monitor those two things and get those monitoring errors down. So what I did is I went to Statistics Canada, found out the exact markets that they were surveying gasoline prices and airline prices, and I called them up. I called up gasoline stations in like Vancouver and across Canada, and I'd say, "Hey, my name is Doug, and I'm in charge of monitoring inflation at the Bank of Canada. Could you give me an idea about what's going on with gasoline prices? Like, are there any gas price wars on?" And the person would be quite surprised in the first encounter, but then they would be trained so well that when I would call them back again, when I knew the appropriate day to call them because I knew what days were being surveyed, where they would actually advise me. And so there's a little bit of an economist in all of us. What would a person sitting in a gas station be doing all day long? Well, they'd look at the sign with the price and they'd ask, am I getting more customers or less customers? And so they might naturally think about why that would be the case. Okay, that's the kind of information that they would have. It's not like the internet now where everybody can get information in different ways. So I found them advising me about what was actually going on. They'd say, no, there's not a price war in our neighborhood, but there's a price war in these other neighborhoods and stuff like that. It's like they'd become little analysts for me. Okay. Now, the second airline prices, we had a woman that would book all of our flights at the Bank of Canada. The only people that flew were senior management. Economists, nobody knew what they did, so I don't think they would want to let us out to interact with the rest of the world. So we had to stay in our little cages. There was no travel and outreach or anything like that back then. All of our resources were effectively deployed on analysis and so on. That would be another way. Plus, nobody in academia knew what we were talking about. It was like entering a completely different world, the world of central banking, which was full of secrecy and so on. Okay, so what I did is I went to this woman and I said, "Look, you really helped me out." She had one of these old terminals, which actually you might still see to this very day. The airline industry has been so slow to change these things. And I got her to basically keep track of the airline prices in the markets on the days that they were being surveyed, allowing me to effectively replicate the CPI. Okay, I was getting food from Agriculture Canada. And so effectively you're just replicating it. Okay. And so my maximum error fell to 0.1. Well, you'd say, why the heck would you want to waste so much time doing that? Well, the answer is it didn't waste any time. I was building models and doing research at the same time. It was just an efficient way of doing current analysis and so on. That was a good story there because when I passed off the job, I then moved to coordinating the projection group from that job. And when I passed it off and I was training the new person, she said, how did the guy before you took over this job do it? Because she didn't want to call up people in gasoline stations. Now, for many of you guys, for you guys to be looking at data in Armenia and Georgia, there's probably, in many cases, more information hanging around the airport, drinking coffee, that you're going to get waiting for some data to be released and analyze it with some silly statistical procedure. Now, I promised to talk about the famous line in the Archam video, which you'll have to find. And that is the whole assumption of linearity and stuff. And obviously linearity gives us tractability, but it also gives us nonsense when we think about policy. Jacob Frankel explained it in a seminar more than a year ago when we're getting feedback on the development of FPAS Mark II. He said, thinking about doing policy in a linear world is like taking your car out, okay, and assuming that the road is perfectly straight. You can put the pedal to the metal and look just out the back window. You don't need to look forward at all. If the road is perfectly straight, you can go as fast as you want, okay, and the world will be really easy. But as Archam pointed out, if it is the windy road leading up to the Diligent Training and Research Center, which is anything but linear, one needs to follow a different strategy about thinking about monetary policy under uncertainty with their important non-linearities. And as Arjun said, failing to recognize this might end you up in the hospital or worse. And so on that note, I think what we will do is end today's session, given that I've gone a little bit over time.
Thank you for watching our video. For more information on the bootcamp, you can go on the Better Policy Project website and scroll down. You have the option download brochure, and there you will have all the significant dates, the designated speakers that are going to be giving the classes, and also how, like, a small introduction to how the bootcamp is going to work. Then we can also take a look at the courses that we have available. These are courses that help any economist or beginning economist to learn how to use these programs, such as Python and Diner Julia, MATLAB, all these important programs. Thank you so much, and hope to see you in the next video.